How many of you have been ice fishing? Probably not, because you haven't lived in Wisconsin. It's the national pastime. They have little cabins that they stick right out on the lake that you go to. So when we lived up in northern Wisconsin, my dad would take us ice fishing. Now, you know that means it was like below zero probably, I don't know. So we're all bundled up in, you know, the big puffy suits, not like they have out here. I mean, we're talking in depth. You're fully covered from head to toe with the mask over you. Only he didn't have one of those cabins or a tent. Him and his other pastor friend would dig a hole in the ice and put their lines in, and they would take us kids along so we were out of the mom's hair for the day, right? You stick that line in that hole and you just wait and wait and wait. My brother abandoned us for the shore. The other pastor kid ran to the shore to play. I'm sitting there waiting for a fish to come out of that hole on the line. Eventually, I abandoned the hole also and went to the shore to play, to build snow forts and throw snowballs. Unlike my brother, who looked at that hole and said, they're never getting a fish. He knows my dad's rate of return on fishing, and went immediately to the shore to play. In our scripture today, and in the Gospel of Mark, that word, immediately, occurs over and over again because Mark wants you to get the sense that God is really active and present, right? God broke open the heavens, came down to earth, and is set loose, and immediately things start to happen, right? Jesus is thrown out into the wilderness. After he comes back from the wilderness, he sees some fishermen, and immediately he invites them to join him on the journey. He says to Simon and Andrew, follow me, I will make you fish for people. And immediately, so see the emphasis, right? He wants you to get the sense that God is moving and active, that it's a passionate, exciting story. So immediately, the brothers jump up and join Jesus on the shore. And they walk down a little farther, running into two other brothers who are out there mending their nets in their dad's boat. And Jesus says, follow me. And then that word happens again, right? Immediately, they jumped out of the boat and followed. They followed Jesus on a new journey. They followed Jesus into a new life. Immediately. There's a sense of urgency within the Gospel of Mark that wants you to know that God is directing us, calling us, pushing us, and pulling us to jump into the story, to jump in and set out on the new adventure, to passionately embrace God in this journey. Unlike me, who took a long time to say yes, those disciples said yes right away. And maybe it's because they made connections in the story that I didn't have. Or their connections were different. They knew that when Jesus was calling them to fish, he was reminding them of the words of other prophets who had spoke out about who God was calling and what God was doing, God's activity in the world. So when they heard Jesus say, come away and fish with me, they were reminded of the prophet Amos, who had suggested that God is a fisherman, and that God is the kind of fisherman who threw that hook in, hopefully not in that ice hole where the fish never came. He threw out that hook, and he catches the fish that don't belong. When Amos talks about God the fisherman, he was talking about hooking those fish that are causing trouble for the people who are righteous. He says that God hooked, says Amos, you will drag away with hooks, and with fish hooks you will be caught and taken off. He believes that God will capture those who are practicing injustice and violence. That God will drag away those people who are injuring his people. And when they heard Jesus say, come and fish, maybe one of the things that went through their mind was that image of Amos, that part of what they were being called to was to challenge the injustices, to challenge those people who were hurting others, who weren't practicing the faith in the way that God had called them to, who were leading the people astray. Maybe they heard it and thought that's what we're being invited to do, to hook other people. Or maybe when they heard it, they heard the call of Ezekiel, because the prophets like to talk about fishing. Not as much as they like to talk about being shepherds, but they do mention fishing. In Ezekiel, in chapter 11, that prophet also compares God to a fisherman and says, you have been scattered to all the corners of the world because of the unjust ways you have lived in this world. But God, the fisherman, is going to come like a fisherman, catch you all in a net and bring you home. So God was going to be like the fishermen that they were, throwing that net wide. And all the people had been dispersed because the prophets are speaking to the people of Israel who had been captured again and again, dragged into foreign lands, escaped into foreign lands to be safe. And God was going to bring them all home, bring them all back. Or maybe they heard Jeremiah. Jeremiah says that God will send someone to fish the people of Israel out of where they are and bring them back to the land that God gave them. And so John and Andrew and Peter and James knew those stories, knew those words of the prophets. Those fishermen knew that Jesus was inviting them on a journey with God that would be a journey at risk, a journey of justice. Chad Myers, who is one of my favorite theologians, especially about the book of Mark, says that Jesus is using the fishing metaphors like Jeremiah, Amos, and Ezekiel when he's calling Simon and Andrew, James, and John. He's using that metaphor to invite the disciples into this journey where they will lift up the lowly. The gospel is meant to show us a different order that doesn't rely on cruelty, doesn't rely on the powerful being cruel, doesn't rely on dispossessing people, but instead relies on gathering them back in. Jesus wants to change the world that has been a very hostile place for his neighbors, the people he saw every day. And so his first step is to gather those co-workers, to drag them in with the nets, where everything is pulled in. The good and desirable fish, the undesirable fish, the inedible fish, the seaweed. I mean, they fish like me. So when we would go visit my grandfather in Texas, and we'd go out on the pier, and we would fish, and he would tell us, and you could fish like back in the day, so back a long time ago. Anything you threw in when we were down there would get caught. The problem was, I always caught the bottom crawlers. You know, the catfish and dogfish down on the bottom. And he would look at them when they would come up and he would say, no, no, no. And throw all my fish back because they were not good enough. Jesus is going to catch all those fish. The good fish and the bad fish. The inedible fish, the ones that don't taste so good, the ones that you go, ooh, they eat some really nasty stuff, so we don't want to eat them. He catches all of those fish because he wants to throw out the net so wide that everyone hears that message of God. That everyone hears about the God who says you are welcome. About the God who says, I will rip the powerful from their thrones. About the God who says, you are not meant to be enslaved. You're meant to be free. He's going to invite that net to spread far and wide over all the people that he encounters. The nice ones and the not so nice ones. He's going to throw that net and grab in those who are in search of healing and wholeness. He's going to throw those nets and ensnare those who have been captured by evil so that he can cast that evil up. He's going to throw out that net and rake in some people that we would say he's not allowed, and even turn them into disciples that take the message even farther. Both those sets of brothers show us the hope and possibility of being invited to follow Jesus. We're given the chance to jump into a different life, a life with God present. So who is God calling us to follow today? So you're going to say, oh, the pastors. But remember, in this metaphor, I would be the Jesus, right? Throwing the net. So that means that if I throw my net, who am I going to capture? Who is going to be the one called to follow Jesus? If I throw out my net, is Jonathan going to get scooped up in it and invited to jump in immediately? When I cast out my net, is Taizi going to jump up and invite others to come along for the journey? When I throw out my net, it has to reach down far because it looks like Adela's in the ice hole. But it'll scoop Adela up and invite her on the journey to join Jesus. Jesus, when he invites others into this journey, he invites all of us to be disciples. Because disciple doesn't mean the leader of the church. Disciple means someone who studies at the feet of Jesus. Somebody who hears the words, the stories, is inspired from them, is moved by them, and shares that story with those they encounter. Their family and their friends, their neighbors, the people that they encounter in their daily life. The ones who look like somebody Jesus would throw the net on. Someone who's looking a little sad when you're in the grocery store. Someone who's looking troubled. Jesus throws out that net and captures them all, inviting them into this journey, into this new kingdom where they're not left behind, where they're invited as full members, where the people of God show what it means to live a life where the wholeness of you is brought to bear, where your insides, all those parts of you that hurt, are broken open so that God could come in and fix them. That when Jesus throws out that net and you're invited to jump in, what will you say? What will you say if Jesus says to you, follow me?